Thank you all for coming. I have someone here that I think needs no introduction. He is an author, a historian, and a great friend to the Osterville Village Library, Anthony Sammarco. Thank you very much.
It's funny, I knew Lisa and Milton a few years ago. I won't say how long, but I think in a lot of ways, this is a fun way to actually support the library. And in many instances, maybe you too would like to become a friend of the Osterville Library. But today the lecture's on Thanksgiving traditions, and I'm sure everyone here has already begun to prepare for Thanksgiving next Thursday. It's a major holiday, but it's only been a federal holiday since 1863. Abraham Lincoln would sign it into a law that it would be the fourth Thursday of the month of November. And in that instance, Thanksgiving in the 19th and early 20th century would evolve as the Pilgrim culture. Not everything that was done, either in paintings or in written format, was totally correct, as we'll see. But in some ways, it emulated the determination of the Pilgrims who actually would settle the New World in 1620. And seen here on a cover, we not only have a groaning board with people of the Pilgrims surrounding it, but a minister saying a prayer. We realize in some ways that that painting conceptualizes what the first Thanksgiving would have been in 1621. Sure.
No, it's my phone.
It sounds like when I teach at Boston University. A year ago, the entire semester was by Zoom. I would have maybe one student that would arrive and she would be on the other side of the room completely. So what I would say after a discussion, are there any questions? There was total silence. So I didn't know if they were asleep or they were walking the dog or preparing dinner or basically listening to me but had no questions. But anyway, Zoom is a place in some ways that we're also including. So Thanksgiving traditions in Boston is in some ways, why is this not moving? Okay, Lisa. Sorry, just try this. I did. I tried that too. Go flash. Do you want to take it out and put it back in? Let's just take it. That's all right. Excuse us.
Difficulties.
Oh, you did it. So is that it? Oh, I see. So do next. So I'm going to do previous. All right. Okay. We find out. So this is a book that I dedicated to Sarah Josepha Hale. You may not have heard of her, but in the period of the 1830s, she raised the money to actually help to erect the Bunker Hill Monument. But in the 1840s, she would become editor of Gaudy's Ladies Book, which was a book that was read not only in Osterville, but on the west coast of the United States. And it not only talked about fashion and topics of history and politics, but every time that it would come to November, she would write a thing about Thanksgiving and how it was an important feature that should be a federal holiday. Well, this Eduard silhouette shows her seated, holding her petition to Abraham Lincoln. And of course, as I mentioned, he would sign it into effect in 1863. So I call her the mother of the American Thanksgiving. Well, the whole idea is that during this period of time, people would, as I said, conceptualize what it looked like when the Pilgrims were actually in Boston. Now, in this way, the landing of the Pilgrims done by Henry Bacon shows, of course, Priscilla Mullen, as well as John Alden, but Mary Chilton stepping upon the Plymouth Rock. Now, it's an idea that everyone has always heard about Mary Chilton, but she was not the first person to step on Plymouth Rock. It was probably Miles Standish. But she would be immortalized with the name of the Chilton Club, a Back Bay women's club. But in a lot of ways, this was the type of painting that was being done. Now, in that instance, we realize that many times, next, sorry, I did previous. No polls or quizzes. So in this period, many of the people that were settling in the New World were coming here because of religious persecution. King James I was King of England. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and he succeeded Elizabeth I, his cousin. During that period, he was titular head of the Church of England, and it was his intention that all people, both men and women, become members of the Anglican Church. Well, there were dissenters. Many were still remaining as Roman Catholics, even though there'd been 100 years abeyance between the breaking from Rome. But there was also the fact that there were two groups called the Puritans and the Separatists. Now, the Puritans were members of the Church of England, and they wanted to purify that church from within. They would settle Boston in 1630. But the Separatists, as we know as the Pilgrims, would actually, in that instance, separate from the church. No longer were they members, and they would move to Holland. And in that way, they became religious pilgrims. And during this period, it was a tumultuous time, but we also had to realize in this instance that many of these people themselves would eventually leave England and come to the New World. Because they were Englishmen and because they felt that they were religiously persecuted, what they were doing was creating a new Zion in the New World. In this painting, Pilgrim Fathers Boarding the Mayflower by Bernard Gribble, shows on the right-hand side family and friends waving to their family that were leaving for the New World. They had hired two ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. Each ship was supposed to hold roughly 75 people because there were 144 pilgrims. Once they had left Plymouth Harbor, of course, the Speedwell had actually sprung a leak. They returned, and the Mayflower, only equipped for 75 passengers with the crew, now had double that amount. And seen here, it's a good example to show you in a painting format how people were actually beginning to realize things were different. Well, it was over 3 months to actually come to the New World. And when they finally arrived at landfall, which was Race Point in Provincetown, the Mayflower would dock. And what happened was that men, no women, only the men of the Pilgrims and the crew that was deciding to stay with them would actually sign the Mayflower Compact. And this painting by Jean-Léon Ferris in 1899 shows William Bradford, who would be elected the first governor of Plymouth Bay Colony, along with a group of people sitting around signing into effect what would eventually become a law for the good of their new colony. Well, this was a major feature because you realize that the upper right-hand side, which was Race Point at Provincetown, which is called the first encounter, would eventually see them sailing west across Cape Cod Bay to Plymouth. Now, Plymouth at that time, they arrived on December 20th of 1620, was the height of the winter. And this was a fanciful drawing, again, of a shallop leaving the Mayflower to bring passengers to Plymouth Harbor. And seen here at the very head of the shallop was, of course, Mary Chilton. These paintings and prints create that aspect of what they believed was the truth. But the whole concept was when they arrived, they actually encountered tremendous problems. During that winter, where they had to find rudimentary shelter, not only huts and caves, but they actually lost half of their entire colony. It was either pleurisy and pneumonia, and only 70 people survived. But in the spring of 1621, it was thanks to Massasoit, the chief or sachem of the Wampanoag tribe, that would actually teach them how to actually plant corn, and of course beans and gourds and pumpkins. During 1621, they would have a fruitful harvest, and it was thanks to Massasoit. And in the first decades, there was a very comfortable relationship between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims. But as we began to realize, they were creating a new Zion. This painting by George Boughton was done in 1905, and it shows pilgrims going to church. Well, in the very center, we not only see the minister leading his flock, but they're preceded and followed by pilgrims with muskets. I assume there must have been a wild animal aspect, or maybe even the possibility of the Native Americans themselves attacking them, though it never happened. But they were cautious. And in that instance, you began to realize that these paintings were a major feature of that whole idea. Well, after a great harvest in 1621, what they really had was a harvest supper, but it was called the First Thanksgiving. And Jenny Brownscombe painted this in 1914. This is the cover of the book. The pilgrims seated around the table, the minister saying a prayer, a woman in the foreground rocking her new baby, and Native Americans on the upper right-hand side sitting on the grass. You had to realize there were only 4 women that survived that first winter. So it was not only a reduced colony, but it would only see people coming in 1623 to actually help them. And in that way, many times, one of the things about Plymouth Plantation, or Plymouth Patuxent as we call it today, was to recreate what the pilgrims entailed. Remember, they came to the New World. There were no houses, there was no shelter. And they built small houses, which were usually one-roomed houses with lofts. And they had a street called Water Street, which was the first street in the Plymouth colony. But Henry Hornblower, who was a scion of Hornblower and Weeks, one of the major investment companies in Boston at the turn of the 20th century, would ask his grandmother for her estate on Eel River. She deeded it to him, and they began in that instance creating Plymouth Plantation in the 1950s as an interpretation of what they thought the pilgrims might have lived in. Now, in that period, these first houses were designed by a man named Charlie Strickland. I knew Charlie as a young man, and he was somebody who was the son of the architect of the Ritz-Carlton. So he came from an architectural background, and of course, he was also a descendant of Charles Rutan. We realized in that instance, he designed a single room, which were pine boards, and of course, a thatched roof. Was typical of the period, might have been the type of a thing the pilgrims actually had lived in. But in this instance, this photograph, which I found on eBay, actually shows Spencer Brewster in the doorway and his wife, Marietta Withington Brewster, along with their children, Anne, Marley, and Spencer Brewster, in a publicity photograph, because this building in 1948 was originally built on Water Street, where the Mayflower II is located. And of course, these photographs not just showed him arriving at the small house with a musket and a turkey over his shoulder, but it also showed them sitting down to dinner after Mrs. Brewster had roasted it over a spit in the fireplace. Well, this is a photograph, again, from 1948, and it not only shows the family and her young baby in a cradle, but a Native American on the right-hand side. It's conjecture. But this also shows a man who would never have worn this headdress in Plymouth. This is a Western headdress of feathers. So it was, again, a learning process between the 1940s and the 1960s. This whole concept, though, was a major feature of reenacting the early years of the Pilgrims. But during that period, they just didn't build those single-family houses, the one-room place. They also built an old fort that also served as a meeting house. When it was built in 1953, again, it was on Water Street, right on the waterfront, before it was moved in 1958 to the new Plymouth Plantation. And these postcards of the period begin to show these people going to mass or services at that time in a way to see how, in some ways, it might have been done. But when Plymouth Plantation opened, and this is a 1627 Thanksgiving reenactment, probably in the early 1960s, You see in front of that one building, not only a groaning table, but all sorts of meats that probably were enjoyed by the Pilgrims. Not only roast turkey, a haunch of beef, as well as seafood and fish, but it would also in some ways show the Native Americans on the left-hand side. Remember, the story was that the Native Americans joined the Pilgrims in that harvest supper. And the whole concept here was that Plymouth Plantation was reinterpreting the whole concept. Well, thanks to Sarah Josepha Hale, she was somebody in a lot of ways that actually showed how important it was. And of course, Abraham Lincoln in 1863 signed the Thanksgiving Proclamation. And of course, it was an important feature. He said that the year that is drawing to its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. And in that instance, it was something that was thanks to the providence of Almighty God. In that area, we realized in the 1860s, it was also the same year, 1863, that he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So it was a momentous time to create something as a nationwide celebration of Thanksgiving. And seen here, Sarah Josepha Hale in the 1870s not only was well aware of the power of the written word, and she used it to the best possible advantage, but her Gaudy's Ladies book was something that was enjoyed by people of all walks of life. In this instance, when this came to fruition, she said point blank that Thanksgiving is, quote, the uniting as one great family republic, unquote. And in that instance, you realized it wasn't just the descendants of the Pilgrims and the Puritans that were celebrating Thanksgiving. In the mid-19th century, Boston and the surrounding areas was becoming tremendously different and a thriving nexus of cultures. Boston's population in 1865 was 165,000 people, of which one half were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. So by this great family republic, we were beginning to see Thanksgiving being enjoyed by people of all walks of life. But there were poets and writers in the 19th century that also created things that many people realized would come down to us, but were totally fictitious. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a noted poet in his day. He taught at Harvard College as well as Bowdoin College. But he was also a man who wrote a poem, probably the longest poem I've ever read, The Courtship of Miles Standish and Other Poems. And in that instance, it recounts the fact that Miles Standish had a crush on Priscilla Mullins. The idea here was he was too shy to approach her, so he asked John Mullen to court her for him. As a result, Priscilla fell in love with John and she asked him to speak for himself. They later married and had 18 children. But in that instance, Longfellow created something that is still read, but it's not quite true. There was another woman, Lydiamariah Child, that actually was quite a well-known women's rights activist and very well-known writer. Her father was Francis Converse, who lived in Medford, Massachusetts, and he created what was called the Medford cracker. It was a pilot cracker, and it actually could sustain shelf life, and it was very good for sailors on ships. But in the period of the 1820s, she was a very important person, and she wrote The Frugal American Housewife. And in that instance, not only was she an ardent abolitionist, women's rights activist, and novelist and journalist, but she wrote a poem that talked about over the bridge and through the woods to grandfather's house we go. Well, her grandfather is a somebody said Laura is not all right. She was not only an ardent abolitionist, as I mentioned, but she was a well-known writer. And her poem, Over the Bridge and Through the Woods, talked about the family going their horse-drawn sleigh across the Mystic River on the Craddock Bridge, which still survives, and going to grandfather's house. It still stands on South Street in Medford, and it's actually owned by Tufts University today. So with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Lydiamariah Child, we realized in some ways that this cult of the Puritans and the Pilgrims was coming to fruition. And seen here, Home to Thanksgiving by Currier and Ives, gives a nostalgia look at the old home. And the man in the very center has just alighted from his horse-drawn sleigh. He greets his parents and younger brothers and sisters. And this concept shows a lovely snow-covered setting with the young man who has just arrived home being greeted to go home for Thanksgiving. Well, in that instance, of the 1860s and 1870s, the United States had actually begun to industrialize. And in that way, many people didn't live in the same village, let alone same area as their family. And by coming home, it began in some ways to become that wonderful aspect of hearth and kin. Well, during the period of the 1858 period, it was actually a grouping of prints that were done by Winslow Homer that shows here Thanksgiving Day, arrival of the old home. And this couple with their children have just left their horse-drawn carriage and are greeted by her mother and father, along with a group of family members. And in this instance, the warm greeting of the old home with its memories of past Thanksgivings was to become a new one that day. Well, these were read by thousands of people, and we began to realize in some ways when they were going home, people were beginning to enjoy a roast turkey dinner. Well, seen here, John James Audubon actually did plate number 1 in his book, The Birds of America. It was a noble bird. And of course, even not only Benjamin Franklin, but President John Adams had advocated that this become the bird of the United States. So instead of the eagle, we might have seen the wild turkey. But it was a major feature because in this instance, turkey seemed to appear on everyone's table by the period of the mid-19th century. And this print, again by Winslow Homer, Thanksgiving Day and the Dinner, shows not only father standing at the head of the table carving the turkey, and of course his family and friends clinking glasses for a happy Thanksgiving, but you see on the lower right-hand side, the children's table. I think I was 14 when I finally was allowed to sit at the big table. But in that instance, he's actually gave a good example of what it was to have a Thanksgiving dinner 150 years ago. But there was also that aspect of the recent immigration to the United States. Beginning in the 1840s, it wasn't just the Irish coming because of the famine. It was the Germans coming because of the social upheavals of 1848. And then we began to see not only Western Europeans, but Eastern Europeans, as well as the Mediterranean coming. This was the first Thanksgiving dinner, and it was done in 1868, again in Harper's Weekly. And it shows a young immigrant girl in the dark dress and headscarf sitting at the dining room table enjoying her first taste of turkey. Now juxtapose her in the dark dress, shawl, and bonnet, and the little girl on the right. She's in black and white, but we know she's wearing a white lace dress with ribbons. She's probably blonde and blue-eyed, but this was the concept of the immigrant child and the native-born child. And we began to realize that this pilgrim custom was something that was actually creating a culture. And even Thomas Nast, one of the best-known political cartoonists of 19th century America, created this, Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. Now, in the instance, on the upper right-hand side, we see Uncle Sam at the head of the table carving the roast turkey. And on the lower right, we actually see Columbia with her tiara. And at the table are seated people such as Native Americans, Africans, Chinese, Irish, German, French, Spanish, Arab, and Italian. And Nast is idealizing this dinner as an all-inclusive dinner of people of all walks of life, ethnicity, race, religion. And if you notice in the four corners, it says free and equal and come one, come all. Because by this period in 1869, the United States was embracing people of all walks of life. During that period of time, dinner was a major feature, but you also might want to send a Thanksgiving card to a family or friend. Not everybody lived locally, so it was nice to keep in touch. Well, one of the major lithographers of 19th century America was Louis Prang. Prang had come to the United States in 1848 from Germany. And what he did was to open a lithographic studio in Roxbury, Massachusetts. During that period of time, he did not only scenes as much like Currier and Ives, but he was also in 1874 to print the first American Christmas card. And during that period, there were greeting cards of all sorts of things, including other holidays, including Thanksgiving. This was his first Thanksgiving card. Now, doesn't that look like a Thanksgiving picture? It says, "A cheerful Thanksgiving to you." And of course, it's a sheaf of pears. But on the upper left-hand corner, it says, a bundle of great pears, bell-shaped and streaky, some rich orchard's pride. Well, it was very nice, and it would be something that people would probably be very happy to receive. But by the 1890s, some of his cards were really quite jocular. And seen here, we have a turkey with her poults standing around a pie. And as it says, enjoy well and well, digest Thanksgiving bliss. And oh my God, I have the thing right on the bottom here. Else you'll be troubled by a dream like this. Do you see the child's head and hands emerging from the pie? Well, these were things that many people probably thought were really quite fun. It was very different. But you also had people such as Joseph Leidensecker, who was probably one of the better known graphic artists of the 20th century. He did this as Thanksgiving 1648, which was for the American Weekly in 1940. And it shows at the very head of the table, the Pilgrim Father, the Pilgrim Mother seated, all saying their prayer. But the little boy with his blonde bowl-cut hair looks more at the feast of the turkey than he does immersed in his prayer. These cards, some of which were also Nationwide magazine full-color pages, would in some ways be brought to the fruition of really saint-like situations, such as Norman Rockwell. And seen here, a young boy stares at his grandmother as she's actually preparing a pie and cutting the dough. Do you notice that grandmother has a halo? Well, this was in the Saturday Evening Post, and it was a major feature to realize that Norman Rockwell was creating something that not only was a typical thing that almost everyone would have done to make their own pies, but it became something that was synonymous with that idea of Thanksgiving. And here, a bespectacled woman by Norman Rockwell holds a platter with a roast turkey, with the Thanksgiving as her halo directly above her head. This was in the Literary Digest in 1919. So each of these were a great example. And of course, Norman Rockwell was the great chronicler of middle-class America in the 20th century. But probably one of his best-known features, and it's become an iconic painting, was one of the 4 Freedom series called Freedom from Want. And in this instance, what he does is show a couple at the head of the table as she places the roast turkey with her family and friends surrounding the table. In this instance, Norman Rockwell actually used his own dining room as the place that actually was painted, and the woman was his own cook in Vermont. So these paintings, which would be translated into Nationwide magazine advertisements, as well as greeting cards, were an important way to perpetuate that idea of the Puritans and Pilgrims. But here, after a Thanksgiving dinner, I'm sure you too have eaten a little bit too much. Norman Rockwell actually showed a pilgrim in the stocks with the sign, "Ye glutton." So in a lot of ways, these were things that were really quite fulfilling. You also see in this book, Happy Thanksgiving, and these 2 children not only perpetuate the ideal Thanksgiving Day children, but one is dressed with his huge pilgrim hat and the little girl with her collar and bonnet. Not only do they have, as you see here, a wonderful aspect of gourds and pumpkins, as well as Indian corn in the foreground, but you also see this little poem that I composed. My turkey, 'tis of thee, sweet bird of cranberry, of thee I sing. I love thy breast and wings, back, legs, and other things. I love thy good stuffing, O luscious bird. Well, in that instance, these children were the pilgrim children come to life. And in many ways, many people realized that that turkey by the 20th century was something that was not available in major supermarkets, frozen and ready to roast. In this photograph, Thresher and Kelly Meat Company, which was at the Quincy Market in Boston, has a woman, very well dressed, on either side of Mr. Kelly and Mr. Thresher, who wear blood-stained aprons. But you see the turkeys on the left-hand side. Now, these were freshly killed turkeys. They had a paper sleeve to stem the blood, but their talons were tied together and they were placed on a hook. And you could actually buy anywhere from a 10-pound up to a 35-pound turkey. But these weren't perfect. You actually still had to pull feathers and quills and singe the quills as well. But when it actually began to roast, it actually probably smelt as good as the one that we will have on Thursday this coming week. Now, seeing here, you had to realize that many times people would actually not know how to cook a turkey. And during the period of the 1960s and 70s, Julia Child was a woman who actually taught on the French chef Bostonians how to not only cook à la Française, but how to enjoy the process and entertain family and friends with a well-prepared gourmet dinner. Seen here with her turkey, after stuffing it and roasting it, with a glass of wine, of course, she was somebody who actually showed many people how to cook. But seen here in a 1950s photograph, mother is in the kitchen, often at 5 or 6 in the morning, preparing the turkey, stuffing the turkey with aromatic vegetables such as garlic and onions and carrots to actually prepare it for its 5 to 6 hour roasting. And in that way, the turkey dinner itself, as you can almost imagine, when grandmother opens the door to baste the turkey, we can almost imagine these two children saying, ooh, that was the wonderful aroma of the roasting turkey, something that would take over 6 or 7 hours to prepare and only 15 minutes to eat. But in that way, Thanksgiving dinner became synonymous, not just with that great American Republican family, but with the aspect of family and friends coming together. It's seen here in a photograph of a Thanksgiving dinner in the 1930s. Grandfather catches his grandson's eye. He's not so involved in the prayer before dinner, but he's looking at the roast turkey. But what I like about this photograph is the glass of celery. I serve celery every year with olives, even though no one ever eats it. But that was the typical thing that was done when I was a child, so I continue it. But seen in this way, this child with her tongue at the ready is looking at her father carve that wonderful roast turkey. And you have the bounty in the foreground of mashed potatoes and sliced tomatoes, as well as a bounty, of course, pumpkins and pomegranates. It was an important feature, but you also had to realize that you could never have turkey without cranberry sauce. This photograph that dates to 1945 shows two very well-dressed children looking at the roast turkey on the table, but in front of them was a tray of cranberry sauce. Now, cranberries have been known here on Cape Cod in the 19th century. They actually alleviated scurvy, and they were used by many sailors. But after a sandstorm, they actually began to cultivate them professionally. One of the biggest was, of course, Ocean Spray. And during the period of 1912, not only did they do a commercial cranberry sauce, but they also began to do cranberry juice. But in the period of 1941, the first aspect of canned log cranberries was actually produced by Ocean Spray. And we see it still today as one of the things on my table, including homemade. It's an important way to realize that everybody wanted that roast turkey, but do you still take the wishbone? Well, this is a larger than life wishbone with, of course, Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. You realize in some ways that they're really no different than we are. At the end of the meal, maybe the wish will come true. Hopefully, it's for people to come back a year later. During this research, I was also intrigued that Thanksgiving would actually have a Thanksgiving Day parade in Boston. I'm sure, just like me, you watched the Macy's Day Parade. It's a tradition in our house. But the idea here was that Jordan Marsh Department Store started the Thanksgiving Day Parade, and it was actually to begin in 1929 and it ended in 1943. It went from Kenmore Square along Beacon Street to the State House, and then down Park Street and Winter Street to Jordan Marsh. Seen here in 1939, this balloon was the two acrobats balloon. Unfortunately, the larger of the two has a deflated derriere, but the idea was here that it was 5 stories in height. And many of these balloons had once flown in the Macy's Day Parade and were given to Jordan Marsh the following year. But beginning in 1929, this attracted thousands of people. And by the height of the Depression, it was said that over 50,000 people came out in Boston just to see this along Beacon Street. Some of the balloons were incredible. Do you remember Mickey Mouse? Well, of course, not only was Mickey Mouse a famous and popular cartoon character, but he was such a large balloon, 3 stories in height, they had guide wires. And of course, the guide wires were important because people had to hold them. Otherwise, he descended to the heavens. But look down below. Those people that act as the guide wire holders are dressed like mini mice. And in that way, not only was it fanciful, but it was also interpretive of the individual balloon. Other balloons included the Porky Pig balloon. And don't remember, of course, he was a popular cartoon character in the late 1930s and early 1940s. This was in 1931. And of course, it was in the heralding of the impending arrival of the Yuletide season. Well, Porky Pig, with his star on his chest, waddles up Beacon Street with rope handers dressed as Chinese, Arabians, and Celts, replete with spears and circular shields. We realized in that way that this was something that was bringing people out when they should be preparing for Thanksgiving. This balloon was the Big Bad Wolf. This was actually inspired by Walt Disney's movie, The Three Little Pigs. Those three little pigs constantly daunted this poor wolf. And in a lot of ways, he became beloved by people. But look at the red suspenders. And again, the guide handlers are dressed as miniature pigs. We also had a disembodied head, but directly behind him was Felix the cat. And Felix the cat, with his black body, white eyes, and giant grin, coupled with the surrealism of the situation in which he was placed, was a great character. And in the 1930s, he was just as popular as Mickey Mouse. But look at the people lining Beacon Street on either side. Just to the left would be the Boston Common. My favorite was the two-headed giant. This was 4 stories in height, a giant that had 2 heads, 2 bandanas, and 2 gold earrings. One of them holds a spiked mace. This had actually floated in the Macy's Day Parade in 1936, but in 1937 it came to Boston. So these were an important feature, and they went for over 10 years. But in 1943, at the height of World War II, the silk of the balloons was needed for the war effort, as was the helium that inflated them. So in that instance, Jordan Marsh discontinued it. But we also began to realize in that period that there were more permanent monuments to the Pilgrims. And this, which was actually a baldacchino designed by J.H. Hammett Billings of Milton, was placed over Plymouth Rock in 1888. This was a major feature because you see the boats that would come from Lewis Wharf in Boston and dock at Plymouth on the left-hand side. And people would come not only in the summer months, but especially during the month of November. In that instance, it covered a rock which was now becoming suspect because many people, including descendants of the Pilgrims, wanted to take a piece of Plymouth Rock home with them. It was actually protected now by grading, and it still allowed a tidal flow, but it was engraved with the year 1620. And in that way, we would also see in Plymouth the monument to the Pilgrim forefathers. Again, this was designed by J.H. Hammett Billings, begun in 1859, but not finished until the 1870s. The base alone is 83 feet of granite, and the monument itself directly above is 36 feet of a bronze statue of Faith. And Faith not only holds a Bible under one arm, but points towards the heavens. These were good examples of that pilgrim culture and what they were trying to interpret from the early 17th century settlement. But probably my favorite one of all is the Pilgrim Monument that was built in Provincetown. This was 252 feet. It was built of granite from every state and territory in the United States, and we would see that it was designed by Willard Sears. Sears was a very well-known architect, and to give you an idea, he had designed Isabella Stewart's house, Fenway Court, in the Fenway of Boston. But you begin to realize that this was something, when it was completed in 1910, that really memorialized the first encounter. And it was something that brought many people to Provincetown by that ferry. And here at the laying of the cornerstone from left to right, we not only had John Lewis Bates, who was Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, United States Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, President Theodore Roosevelt, and Governor Curtis Guile, Governor of the Commonwealth. along with 3,000 invited dignitaries who would sit in chairs on the edges of that hill. But the whole idea is when you begin to realize the biggest of all of them was the Mayflower II. Now, the Mayflower II has recently gone through a restoration. During COVID, of course, there were no dedications or memorializations for the 400th anniversary of the settlement of Plymouth Plantation. But the whole idea here was that this was actually designed by a United States naval architect, William Baker. We saw the Mayflower II as an interpretation of what an early 17th century ship might look like. Remember, we didn't know anything about the Mayflower. We did know 144 passengers and crew came on it. But the whole idea here was that this was an exact replica of a ship of the period. The only difference was it had electricity. During that period of time in 1957, this was done in a way to actually memorialize the connection between the United Kingdom and the United States. And we would see a group of not only crew, but the captain, Alan Villiers, actually applying to be the crew on the Mayflower II. They had to be either yachtsmen or people that had their own boats or sloops, so they knew how to actually man a ship of this size. And seen here, when they were on the seas, and they were followed, of course, not only by publicists throughout the world, but when they arrived at the first encounter in Provincetown, they donned reproduction clothing of the 17th century sailor. And as you can see, not only are they on the mizzenmast and the stairs and the poop deck in the distance, but they actually would be greeted by thousands of people, both at Provincetown and later when they sailed into Plymouth Bay. And seen here at Plymouth Bay, they were greeted by Richard Milhous Nixon, who was then Vice President of the United States. And you can see the Mayflower II at dock, but the shallops themselves were manned by members of the Harvard crew. And the men in the foreground would actually be the people who were the official greeters for not only Nixon, but also for the people who had sailed from England to the New World. Well, this was an important feature, and then it became a part of that Plymouth Plantation, a reinterpretation of the Pilgrim culture. But one of the most important greetings was on the right-hand side, Warwick Charlton, who was actually the promoter of the Project Mayflower. And of course, this ship that had been built in the Upham shipyards in Plymouth, England, was a major feature, and he raised the money for it. And of course, he's greeting Henry Hornblower, the grandson of the founder of Hornblower and Weeks, as well as the grandson of the woman who gave her estate for Plymouth Plantation. In that instance, this was something that cemented ties between United Kingdom and United States. But in this book, I also talk about things that we all give thanks, and we have much to be thankful for. During that period of the 1960s, Richard Cardinal Cushing was not only the head of the Archdiocese of Boston, but every Thanksgiving, he would hold a Thanksgiving dinner for senior citizens in Boston at Blimstrom's in South Boston. And seen here, he would even help serve the Thanksgiving dinner. Thousands of senior citizens would come not only to enjoy camaraderie and a Thanksgiving dinner, but there was even dancing afterwards. And if you couldn't get home on your own, a cab was provided for you. In that way, we begin to realize that sense of community, in this instance, is senior citizens. But Cardinal Cushing was also quite a supporter of the Kennedy Memorial Hospital in Brighton. When this was actually dedicated to the son of Ambassador Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, who had died during World War II, we would see in some ways that Cushing would come along with Lutza Smith, who is seen in the very center, to not only greet the children, but actually have a Thanksgiving dinner with them. They hold balloons, but every one of them was handicapped, most of them in a wheelchair. But Lutza Smith was a great philanthropist. Her husband was Lou Smith, who owned Rockingham State Park. And throughout the period, from the 1939 right through to the period of the early 60s, she provided all of the food and accoutrements for every holiday meal, not just Thanksgiving. This was an important hospital, as too was this. And I hate the name, but the Industrial School for Crippled and Deformed Children had been founded in 1893 on St. Paul Street in Boston's Back Bay. Today it's called the Cotting School, and it's in Lexington, Massachusetts. And it did actually educate handicapped children, including those that had contracted polio in the 1950s and 1960s. Well, look at the eyes of the boy in the very center. He's enjoying his turkey leg. The little girl looks a little patronizing, but the other boy could care less. But these schools, whether it's the Kennedy Hospital or the Cotting School, or even the Italian Home for Children, which is in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts, which actually had many orphans, would actually see Edward Riley, who had a plumbing concern in Jamaica Plain, providing dozens of fresh turkeys that would be roasted for their benefit on Thanksgiving Day. This was an important feature because the Italian Home for Children was founded in 1919 when many adults had died in Boston's North End. And in that instance, their children, orphans, would actually be taken in and educated by the nuns, though they attended school locally. So you begin to realize it goes the gamut. But we also would see Thomas Menino, then mayor of the city of Boston, arriving at the Pine Street Inn, along with his grandchildren in the distance. He would actually carve turkeys that would then be served to the homeless and less fortunate. And this was continued after his death by Sean Cardinal O'Malley. And here, serving soup, which was the prelude to the turkey dinner that we all enjoy, these homeless men themselves realize that somebody cares. We all give thanks. It's an important feature. That's what Thanksgiving is purported to mean. And seen here in the early 1960s, this was a luncheon for children at ABCD. This was founded by Robert Cord in 1964 in Boston. It was called Action for Boston Community Development. And it was for inner city children to actually receive a year or two before they entered kindergarten in the public school system. And these children would actually not only color their bandanas, but they would also place either a feather or maybe a turkey that they had actually used crayons on before they enjoyed their soup and turkey dinner. Well, the whole idea is that here in a school in 1970, with a little bit of construction paper, not only the boys and girls create a collar, but they also create a bonnet or a pilgrim's hat or a sheaf of feathers. We realize that the pilgrim culture has come down to us and it's been interpreted many different ways. But today, when we interpret Thanksgiving, we hopefully will always think of family and friends and people that break bread with us. Thanksgiving traditions in Boston is a fascinating glimpse into one of the many different holidays that I've begun to chronicle. I've recently completed not just Christmas traditions in Boston, and of course Thanksgiving traditions in Boston, but this year appeared Easter traditions in Boston. And in 2022 will be Valentine's Day traditions in Boston, as well as Halloween traditions in Boston. These are things in some ways that they're easy to read with great photographs and published by Fonthill in London, but they also show how connected we are. Each one of us come from a diverse ethnicity, race, or religion. And what we do in some ways is to realize that Thanksgiving is that great equalizer. As Americans, we celebrate the Pilgrim culture with not only the landing at Pilgrim Rock, whether it was Mary Chilton or Miles Standish, and we realize in some ways 400 years ago, we've created a new city upon a hill. Thank you very much.